My name is Doug Smith. I have the pleasure of introducing Jim Garman tonight. How many people saw the Newport Daily News 375 supplement last week? Wasn't that a great job of this guy? 90% of it was done by Jim Garman. You know, and this guy is our town historian. I'll tell you, he does yeoman duty. Which one is this? The fourth or fifth in a series of lectures here?
This is 7 out of 10.
This is the second time flies, I guess. This guy's just got so much knowledge in his head. He's such a treasure for our town. So please join me in welcoming Jim Garman.
Okay, this is, as we said, this is the 7th in a series of 10 lectures that I'm doing over the course of the year on Portsmouth and Aquidneck Island as well during our anniversary, and it's brought to you by the 375th Committee as well as the Portsmouth Public Library. Tonight I'm going to talk about a Revolutionary War battle that was fought right here on Aquidneck Island. Before I begin, I really want to give credit to my wife Dottie, who has done a great yeoman's work on these PowerPoints. I give her what I consider a very rough PowerPoint, and then she animates it and makes it work. So I really am appreciative of all that she does for me. So let's get on with the battle. Here we go. Oh, again, I mentioned this last time, but I will again. The best book on the Battle of Rhode Island is this one, Christian McBurney, the Rhode Island Campaign. This just came out last year, and it's really well worth reading. Some people get put off by the size of books sometimes, but I have to tell you that, let me show you something here. The notes start here. Okay, you can see how much is notes. So it's rather well researched. It's about 240 pages, something like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about the battle and the siege. And I actually have divided this, and I have to credit our state historian laureate, Pat Conley, for coming up with the idea that we should talk more about this as two separate things, the siege of Newport and the Battle of Rhode Island. It was two really different things, related, close together, but they really were not quite exactly the same thing. But the important thing is that it happened here, and we can point things out. I know I have a few friends here from off the island, but I'll try to make clear where things happened. I also say, well, let me get on with something else. Okay, the Revolutionary War itself began, at least the shooting of it began, with Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. That was really the beginning of the conflict. The beginning of the Revolution really probably goes back to the Stamp Act crisis in 1764 and a number of events that followed after that, including one of our own, the burning of the Gaspee in 1772 in Upper Narragansett Bay. The overall strategy of the British during this battle, or this war rather, it's kind of an interesting parallel. They decided that they would occupy the major ports, the major locations along the coast. What's interesting about that is that the United States decided to do the same thing in Vietnam. We occupied the cities along the coast and then worked into the interior from there. And that's what the British were trying to do at this point as well. There were 5 major commercial ports in British North America. We all know that Boston and Philadelphia and New York were, but also Charleston, South Carolina, and Newport. Newport was a major commercial port in 1775. And that's really important. We sometimes tend to forget that when we look at the history of the Revolutionary War, but it really was an important port. In fact, the settlement of Newport, if you missed my first lecture about 6 months ago, was that the people who left Portsmouth, not only did they disagree in religion with Anne Hutchinson and others, but they also were looking for a better commercial port. And our town pond out here by the Roger Williams Conference Center didn't quite do it, especially when on the same island you have Newport Harbor, which is an excellent harbor, although pretty swampy back in those days. And there was a lot of fill done to bring it up to speed. But Newport was very important, and people like William Coddington went to Newport primarily for commercial reasons. They wanted to ship their agricultural produce and their animals and things like that. And they did. They shipped them all over the place. They shipped them to Barbados, they shipped them down the Caribbean, and they shipped them to Europe to a certain extent, at least once the war was over. So the British tried to occupy all of those major ports at the beginning of the war, and we're all familiar with Bunker Hill and what went on in Boston, and the British did occupy a great deal of that. So they came to Newport on December 7th, 1776. That's when the British troops first came in large numbers to Aquidneck Island. There were British troops, and there were probably about an equal number of Hessian soldiers, Hessian mercenaries. We hear the term Hessian a lot of times. You might not know what that means. Hessian means that they were from the state of Hesse, which is in Germany. And the British recruited them to come and help fight their battles for them. And the British remained on Aquidneck Island until October 25th, 1779. One of the interesting things is that a lot of the Newport city records, town records in those days, disappeared. They were put on a boat, and the boat was in New York Harbor, and it sank. And a lot of Newport records were lost. Portsmouth records, Portsmouth Town Council records, town meeting records also were lost between 1778 and 1781. Rumors are that they went to Tiverton for storage, but nobody really knows. They've never been found. And it's a little frustrating for historians working with town records to find that, whoops, we got this big 3-year gap there. But that's primarily because the way the British occupied the island was, to be kind, severe. They really were tough on the local inhabitants. And the local inhabitants, animals, farm produce, and so on. They really did a job in terms of throughout the island, not just in Newport, but also all over the island. The British set up forts at strategic positions around the island. The first and most important was Fort Butts. Fort Butts, and the name comes from a man by the name of Enoch Butts, who had a farm on that area. Fort Butts, if you're not familiar with the town, is where the windmill is up behind the high school. The wind turbine, excuse me. That's right next to Fort Butts. And then they had redoubts on Turkey Hill. I'll point these out on a map later. Howlands Ferry, Bristol Ferry, and Fogland Ferry. The British had redoubts. They were short emplacements, gun emplacements, and so on, to protect the island from being invaded by those rebels who wanted to come here. And of course they did that in 1777 on July 17th when they came to what was then known as the Overing House and grabbed General Prescott, General Richard Prescott, who was in command of the British troops on the island, grabbed him and took him off July 17th, 1777. He was later exchanged, and ironically he came back at the time of the Battle of Rhode Island. So the British were harsh. One of the stories is that they not only seized all kinds of farm produce and things like that, but they also they ran out of firewood, and they actually chopped up some houses for firewood. They really were not kindly looked upon by the local inhabitants. Many of the local inhabitants fled. Newport's population declined significantly during that time. So what the Americans were trying to do is to drive the British out. And keep in mind, one of the biggest problems the British had was 3,000 miles of ocean for their supply lines. That was difficult. That was very difficult, especially when you consider that the normal crossing was somewhere between 60 and 80 days. Okay? So their supply lines were really long, and that ultimately was one of the major reasons why the British did not succeed in controlling the colonies. So the Americans' effort was to push the British back out, and a lot of this took place, a lot of effort at this took place. At the time of the Battle of Rhode Island, George Washington was in White Plains, New York, trying to get them out of New York. And other armies were around different places as well. So they're trying to defeat the British regulars and their Hessian mercenaries as well. Very significant to our Battle of Rhode Island was a major campaign that was launched by the British to divide the colonies from the rest divide the New England colonies from the rest of the colonies. What they wanted to do was to launch one army down from Quebec, another army over from the area of Lake Ontario, and another one up from New York City. In other words, a three-pronged attack that was going to cut the colonies off from the New England colonies off from the rest of the colonies, figuring that that would really weaken the colonies if they did that. Well, that didn't work. That campaign did not work. The army that came across upstate New York was forced to turn around. Their supply lines were getting too long. They really had a hard time. This was under General St. Leger. Then another army came up from New York, and they got bogged down as well, although they had more success than most. But the one that really matters is the one that came down from Canada, and that was led by General Burgoyne. And Burgoyne was met by an American army under General Horatio Gates in the vicinity of Saratoga, not right in Saratoga, but not far from Saratoga, New York. And a big battle was fought there on October 17, 1777, and that was critical to what went on, because Burgoyne lost. The Americans won. And everybody, especially the Americans, were very much surprised by that. But they had taken on a British army in the first major campaign, really, of the war, and defeated them. We hear a lot of stories about the ragtag nature of the Continental Army. It really was. And a lot of the Continental Army was militia. And to distinguish between regulars and militia, the militia were people who were citizen soldiers, National Guard, if you will, who would be called up for a short period of time, grab the rifle off the fireplace and go off and fight for a while, and then come home. And that's critical to understanding the Battle of Rhode Island, as we'll see. There were a lot of militia here. So Burgoyne's army was defeated. Now the consequences of that were, and again, the worldwide impact was that people all of a sudden in the world, and remember the 18th century was a period in which there was almost constant warfare going on in Europe. The 7 Years' War was the big one, the 7 Years' War that lasted 9 years, because it started in North America before it got to Europe. It was 7 years in Europe. That ended in 1763, and that was a major campaign, major war, involving all of the major powers of Europe. Anyway, the reaction to Saratoga was one in which the French all of a sudden began to look kindly on the Americans and hopeful that the Americans were serious enough about their military campaign that they would, that the French would consider aiding them. The French and the British were knocking heads all the time. Keep in mind, by the Treaty of Paris of 1763, the French had been kicked out of Canada. They were allowed to keep 2 islands off the St. Lawrence mouth there, Miquelon and Saint-Pierre, and that's all. All the rest of Canada was taken over by the British. Well, here we are 14, 15 years later, and the French see an opportunity perhaps to go back and reacquire Canada if they support the Americans. So the French decided, and they were being pressured by none other than Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris at the time trying to negotiate a treaty, and he succeeded. They negotiated the Treaty of Amity and Commerce in February 6, 1778. This is a copy of the treaty, which you can't read, and a picture of Benjamin Franklin. So the treaty was signed, and it was a military alliance as well as a trade alliance between the Americans and the French. And the French decided they would send troops to help. So on the 13th of April, a French fleet left Toulon, which is down in the southern end of France, southern border of France, and under the Count d'Estaing, took 16 ships and 4,000 troops embarked to go aid the Americans. They had no particular goal, no particular target that they wanted to go to, but it was just a matter of sending support to the Americans, which, as you might imagine, was an enormous morale boost to the Americans. I mean, again, they had really been suffering trying to fight against the British regulars. And now here the French, the second largest army, the second major fleet of the world, coming to their assistance. I think if you compared the American Navy at this point with the French Navy, you'd see quite a contrast. So, d'Estaing took 87 days to cross the Atlantic. And he came to the entrance to Delaware Bay on the 8th of July. And the critical dates that I'm going to be talking about day by day, really, are from the first part of July through the end of August, all of 1778, all 235 years ago. And the battle itself that I'm going to talk about was fought 235 years ago, the day after tomorrow. Okay? I tried to schedule this lecture on that date, but it was a Friday. We figured we couldn't do it. No, Thursday. It wasn't possible to do it. Okay, so with d'Estaing's fleet coming, Admiral Lord Howe got nervous about that and took his ships into New York Harbor, where they were protected by the British Army that was occupying New York. Okay. D'Estaing, they knew that D'Estaing, by the way, he had heavier draft ships. His ships were lower in the water, and there was a sandbar that they knew they couldn't get across. So the French had to just sort of stay outside and wait and hope that Howe would make a run for it, which he did not. So D'Estaing then decided that maybe another port would be worthy of a campaign. And so in discussion with Washington and other people, Washington was in White Plains, they decided that they would take their French ships to Newport to try to entrap General Robert Pigot's army that was in Newport, and hopefully a major combined, I sort of hate to use the phrase, Franco-American effort would be to get a major defeat on Aquidneck Island, and therefore a defeat for the British, that is, and that would, they hoped, end the war. So that's what D'Estaing was motivated to do, to come up this way. The British, meanwhile, sent more troops under General Richard Prescott, whom I mentioned before. General Prescott had been seized, exchanged for another American general, and went back to military action. He had a little bit of a curious reputation around here, especially the fact that he had been captured just a year before. Here's the Count D'Estaing. Count D'Estaing, by the way, was an army officer who led a Navy fleet here, and Lord Richard Howe. So the plan then was to launch a major attack toward Newport, the objective being to force the British to send more troops there, then Washington would have a better chance of seizing New York. So it was kind of a diversion attack that they had planned. So Washington sent some troops. He also sent the Marquis de Lafayette, who was on his staff, to help. Lafayette obviously could speak French, and so they wanted him to communicate with D'Estaing, as did others as well. Washington called upon General John Sullivan, who was a native of New Hampshire, to raise the local militia in this particular case. Again, the militia is kind of the National Guard called up for a short period of time in order to create a large enough army for this campaign. Okay, July 29th, D'Estaing arrives off Newport and anchors offshore. The British are in a panic because they see this French fleet sitting offshore out there, and they aren't really sure what's going to happen. And they sat there for a while. Sullivan, meanwhile, was in Providence. He was told he needed about 5,000 to 7,500 troops, and he had about 2,000. So he sent out to recruit militia from all over the New England states. Washington also sent General Nathaniel Greene to help with this campaign. Nathaniel Greene, a native of Coventry, Rhode Island, turned out to be probably the most successful general of the whole Continental Army, particularly successful down in the southern states in the later stages of the war. So Greene was here at the time of the battle. Recruiting the militia took some time. Sullivan wasn't having very good luck recruiting the soldiers to help him. Sullivan didn't think much of D'Estaing either, and vice versa. They had a few head-knocking incidents where they sent letters back and forth to one another, and Sullivan criticized D'Estaing, and D'Estaing was offended by that, and so on. So it wasn't a close working relationship. The French blocked access to Narragansett Bay. The British saw that they were outgunned. They began to offload men and material from some of their ships that were in the bay, and they were scattered around the bay and also in the Sakonnet River. And they made preparations to get rid of some of those ships, to sink them. Then the French ships came into Narragansett Bay and did a parade past Newport, and a lot of them came up as far as the northern end of Prudence Island in that area. And so they came in, they also came in the Sakonnet River. And so the British abandoned and set fire to two of their ships, the Kingfisher and the Spitfire, which were in the Sakonnet River. Okay, they actually destroyed their own ships rather than have them seized. So on the 1st of August, Sullivan and D'Estaing met, and Sullivan's plan, the overall plan of the battle, was to have the French land on the west shore. If you're familiar with the geography, they wanted the French to come over and land in the vicinity of, sort of just down the hill from Prescott Farm, right on the Middletown, well, what later became the Middletown, there was Middletown this time, on the Middletown line, Portsmouth line. They were going to come in that way, and the Americans were going to come over from Tiverton. I guess I could show you the map behind me, couldn't I? The pointer. They were going to come over, the Americans were going to come over from across Howland's Ferry, which is Tiverton over to Island Park in this area. The French were going to come in this way, right about in the middle. And so the idea was that the British would be caught in the middle in what traditionally is called a pincer movement, and the British would be, British Army in the northern part of the island anyway, would be forced to surrender or fight to the last man if they would. That was the plan. Split the British forces, so on. Meanwhile, Howe had gathered some forces in New York and was on his way as of the same time, the end of July. The British further destroyed more ships in Narragansett Bay. Cerberus, Lark, Orpheus, and Juno. Some of these were sunk right off the coast of the Abbey here, where what's now called Bloody Run Brook flows in, it was then Barker's Brook, flows into Narragansett Bay, right in that vicinity, and also further south. Newport at this time was in chaos. They knew the French were coming. They didn't know when or how. D'Estaing actually began to offload some of his troops onto Connecticut Island, onto Jamestown, just to sort of give them a break from being on ships for 3-4 months at a time. Also, the British sank another ship in the harbor, one called the Lord Sandwich. And the Lord Sandwich allegedly, is the Endeavour. The Endeavour was a ship that Captain James Cook sailed down into the South Pacific in the 60s and 70s and did a lot of research there. Now, there's an organization called the Rhode Island Marine Archaeological Program. It's headed by Kathy Abbas, and they've been doing dives on shipwrecks and things like that. And Kathy's written a book, a collection of books. It was a paper she prepared for the National Park Service, and it's 4 volumes of about 250 pages each about the Battle of Rhode Island. It's not a published book. I got a Xerox copy of it, and it's extremely thorough, especially in regard to the shipwrecks. She really has that in hand. She also got a grant from the National Park Service, and she's trying to work out an arrangement where they can set up a museum of sorts in the vicinity of Fort Butts. And that work is underway, slowly, but it is underway. The British then decided that they were getting nervous, so they decided to withdraw some of their troops from the northern part of the island, because they almost conceded that the Americans could have the northern part of the island, but their idea was to bring their troops back toward Newport, where they would form more substantial lines of defense. Meanwhile, Sullivan was still having problems getting troops, and other troops were being sent to him and so on, and he was not happy with the troops that he got. Most of the militia, especially the Rhode Island militia, were called up for a period of 20 days on August 1st. Keep those dates in mind. August 1st for 20 days. When the 20 days were up and the major battle hadn't been fought yet, it was time to go home and get the corn in and harvest, so some of them left. But this is what Sullivan said in a letter they wrote to another general named William Heath on August 11th. I'll just read one paragraph of it, which gives you a good idea of what Sullivan thought about his army. After collecting and uniting part of the motley and disarranged chaos of militia furnished by this and the neighboring states to the regular corps I have under my command, I directed their march to Tiverton, the place of general rendezvous, where I proposed arranging with more precision dismembered part of this unwieldy body, any power less than the almighty fiat could reduce them to order. Not too thrilled with his recruits, I can see. Okay, now there also had been earlier another plan to invade Aquidneck Island, to push the British out of off Aquidneck Island. And this was under a General Spencer, and it had been carried out. It had been planned to be carried out in October of 1777, a year before what became the Battle of Rhode Island. So Spencer had an army that ultimately included as many as 8,000 troops in Tiverton on October 1st, 1777, but then there were delays. More and more delays, and rain, and delays, and more delays. The attack was planned for October 19th. And the plan then was to come across from Fogland Point, Fogland Ferry, straight across, keep forgetting I have a map here, from Fogland Point, which is this point right here that sticks out, and come straight across to the area of the foot of Heidi Drive, just north of the Manor House, Glen Manor House. That was the plan. They had boat problems. That's a fairly reasonably wide place to get across, much wider than Holland's Ferry was. But that was the plan. And they couldn't get boats. They couldn't get enough boats. And finally, with more and more delays, and the British found out about it, and the British stiffened their defenses in that area, Spencer kept postponing it. And finally, on the 25th of October, he gave it up. That's, again, a year before this. And of course, they probably learned from that wasn't necessarily a good place to cross. That Holland's Ferry. And Holland's Ferry, which again is where the stone bridge was, Rhode Island directions, where the stone bridge used to be, that's where Holland's Ferry went across. And Holland's Ferry goes back to 1640. There was a Holland's Ferry there back then. And it continued, obviously, until the first stone bridge was built. And the first stone bridge was built, which wasn't a stone bridge, it was a wooden bridge, in 1795. The second wooden bridge was built in 1796, as the first one washed out. If anybody's been through there in a boat, sailboat especially, it's a pretty hairy current through there. And so there have been at least 7 bridges across there. The last one, the major stone bridge, was built in 1912, and it survived until the 1954 hurricane, and they kind of patched it together until 1956, which by time this beautiful Sakonnet River Bridge was built to last forever, okay? At least 50 years. Anyway, so that's where Holland's Ferry was. So Tiverton was a launch place for a lot of a gathering place for the Americans to bring their army together. And again, it was reasonably close. It was a relatively short trip across there, although, again, they went across in rowboats when they did come across. It's a little difficult. Anyway, Sullivan had trouble getting boats too and getting his boats there. But they finally got 85 boats, and they were being built while they were planning all this, and they decided to come over and sort of see what was going on over here. And as they did that, the British decided to withdraw back into Newport more. Did it with my pointer. The British fell back in a line across the island about like this, about here, which means, if it can, I'll describe it in modern terms. I think I have that on the next map, or next slide. Let me get to that in a second. The British withdrew anyway, and a line from Coddington Cove, where the Navy base is, across to Easton's Pond. Okay? So the French, meanwhile, when are we going to do something here? They're waiting to fight. And Sullivan kept delaying, saying he needed more troops. So finally, on the 9th of August, when they crossed over, they found that the British had abandoned their positions on the northern part of the island, and so they decided, well, let's occupy them. We might as well stay here. D'Estaing was tremendously offended by that. They weren't supposed to stay there. They weren't supposed to just sort of reconnoiter and see what was going on. But they stayed. That blew up the whole battle plan. So D'Estaing decided that he would probably get his troops back on the ships and decide what course he would take next. Meanwhile, off the southern Rhode Island coast, Howe's fleet of 32 ships, and they didn't know this number, but it had 4,000 more British troops, was spotted off the southern Rhode Island coast. So the French recalled their troops and made ready to go out to sea to fight. The French and American plan was falling apart. D'Estaing sent a few notices to important people saying, "Don't worry, I'll be back." Okay. And so on the 10th, the French fleet departed from Narragansett Bay. They ran a gauntlet of British guns as they went out past Newport. And Howe, meanwhile, this is kind of interesting. Rather than to pursue D'Estaing, Howe decided he'd play a few games out there. And so he turned around and went other directions. And ultimately, there was conflict, naval warfare, on the Atlantic Ocean. It was closer to New York, New Jersey than it was Rhode Island. But they were all fighting with one another out there. Then came the storm. The word hurricane did not exist in 1778, but it, with all likelihood, was one. Okay. And the American troops were camped around Fort Butts and down in front, sort of on the area I'm talking about is where Route 24 begins, on that hillside. Okay? And they were camped out there, not prepared for this kind of a storm. And so they had a hard time, and it went on for 2 days. Meanwhile, out at sea, the same storm hit them, and they kind of gathered together and huddled together. But a lot of storm damage was done, actually, to both fleets, more to the French than the British, however. The Languedoc, which was D'Estaing's flagship, lost all of its masts, its bowsprit, and its rudder. Makes it pretty hard to sail a sailboat that way. They had to rig sails in order to move, plus they were towed partly too. So Sullivan's troops were in the same storm, uncovered. Some of them had tents, a lot of them didn't have tents. They had blankets, which didn't help much. And in this lineup, across from Fort Butts, both directions, to Lehigh Hill, as we call it today, on the west, and over to, well, just about to this area on the east, there were some noteworthy people there. Nathaniel Greene was one. Lafayette was there. John Hancock was there in command of some Massachusetts troops. Paul Revere was there. And Generals John Glover and James Varnum. Glover from Marblehead and Varnum from Warwick. Wasn't he Cranston yet, I guess. So the morale of the troops got really upset, really depressed, and some of them began to go home. It was hard to hold them. And Sullivan's army, which at one point had peaked probably at about close to 10,000, there weren't any really tremendously accurate records, but around 10,000 troops in the Continental forces were beginning to fall apart. The storm cleared slowly on the 14th, and Sullivan ordered his army forward to meet the British. Again, the British had fallen back to that line of Coddington Cove, Miantonomy Hill, okay, and on across, I'm trying to think, the east side of Green End Pond, and the west side of Green End Pond, and over to the beach, down to the beach. And so Sullivan's army was ordered to follow them, come down the east and west main roads, and we had the east and west main roads going back to 1640, by the way. The King's High Road to the east and the King's High Road to the west, following essentially the same route that they do today. So they took up a position, and again, I'll use modern terms because it's hard to imagine some of these names that were different. Sort of from the valley between the troops ran from Shaw's Market back down across Green End and down to the beach. Okay, so the Americans took up position on what was called Honeyman's Hill, which is Quidnick Avenue runs across Honeyman's Hill. Okay, they were on that hillside, and the British were on the other hillside in the area of Bliss Road and over that way, over there. Bliss Road. So they faced each other across Green End, and they had an artillery battle that went on for several days. Okay, and again, very little troop movement as such, very little effort, successful effort to conquer the lines. But they bombarded one another quite significantly. So D'Estaing, with his ships totally beaten up, came back to Newport to tell Sullivan he decided he was going to take his ships and his troops to Boston. That didn't go over too well with Sullivan, as you might imagine. And Sullivan said, no, you can't do that. And Lafayette was sent to talk to d'Estaing to try to convince him at least leave the soldiers here, 4,000 of them. And d'Estaing refused to do that, and so he left on the 21st. Sullivan's reaction was, we've been stabbed in the back, essentially. Okay. So the cannonading still went on across, and Sullivan finally realized that he wasn't going to be able to break through the British lines. Okay. And so one of the things that happened during that time was a sketch was made of the battlefield, and this is it. This sketch was made for a magazine, a British magazine called Gentleman's Magazine. And this particular piece of paper that you see in this frame was published in 1778. It's 235 years old. This is mine. This I found it on eBay, believe it or not. And actually, since then, I've seen the whole magazine. Not just, this is a fold-out. You can see it's creased in the middle. It's a fold-out. But what it shows, you can't see it from where you are. You can come up and look at it afterwards. But Miantinomi Hill is over here. The British lines are here, and then across the Green End Valley, the American lines are over here. And the title is The Siege of Rhode Island, taken from Mr. Brindley's house on the 25th of August, 1778. I'm not sure exactly where Mr. Brindley's house was, but it was probably somewhere around 1 Mile Corner. As much as I can figure out anyway. But anyway, that's a treasure. I also have, by the way, here a cannonball that you can look at afterwards too. Be careful with it. It was found on the battlefield at the Abbey many years ago. And I've seen other people have found stuff over there as well. But that's one of the cannonballs from them. I'm pretty sure from what I can see, and Carl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's a solid shot. It doesn't have any explosives in it. It was just we have the head of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment sitting in the back of the room here. So we got to, I hope he's keeping good track of what I'm saying here, keeping me honest. Okay, so anyway, Sullivan decided to begin to send his camp back north. His troops, and his supplies, and so on, his food, things like that. And so they fell back on the 28th of August, 1778. At the same time, he sent Lafayette on horseback to Boston to try to convince d'Estaing to come back. By this time, there were probably less than 5,000 American troops still under Sullivan's control. And Lafayette did 70 miles in 7 hours, pretty fast ride. Piggott, meanwhile, Newport decided that he would pursue. He would force the Americans back and hopefully force the Americans off the island. That was his plan. He also got a report that Howe was assembling an army and more ships to come to relieve Newport. So we've gone from the siege of Rhode Island, which again is more or less the cannonade back and forth across the valley, now to the battle itself. And in history, in past history, at various times, the island that we live on was called Rhode Island. Okay. The Aquidneck Island is the name of the Indians had for it. So it's kind of gone back and forth. And so, again, the Battle of Rhode Island doesn't mean in the colony of Rhode Island necessarily, but it means the island of Rhode Island. So Sullivan, again, he was in I think you'd probably say an advantageous position, because if he decided to evacuate the island, all he had to do was cross Holland's Ferry, a relatively short distance. And yet, that was his plan. That's what he wanted to do, if necessary. But what he decided to do was to take a stand. And to take a stand in the vicinity of Fort Butts. Fort Butts, again, is right in this vicinity, again, where the wind turbine is up on the hill here. The remains of Fort Butts are still there. It's tremendously overgrown. It's a mess. There's a marble marker there. It's a great place for the high school kids to hang out. But it's really unfortunate that we haven't done anything to really memorialize that location. The British had built the fort, but again, they had evacuated, and so the Americans now moved in, and that's where Sullivan was in command from. So the American position, the plan for the American position was from Quaker Hill and Quaker Hill is where the town hall is. Okay, down Headley Street to Turkey Hill, right above the compactor station. Okay, and across the island that way, and eventually to Lehigh Hill. Now Lehigh Hill, you might not be as familiar with that one. Lehigh Hill is where the scenic overlook is, where you look out at the Kaiser building there. I was going to say White Elephant, but I won't say that. The Kaiser Tower there, okay? That's Lehigh Hill. And Lehigh Hill was really important as a strategic position during this battle that was about to happen. Anyway, so that was the American line across. And they had skirmishers out further south in the vicinity of Union Street on both the East and West Main roads. So he fell back on the early in the morning on the 29th, and Piggott decided to pursue with 6,000 troops. He left some of his troops in Newport, but he took most of his troops with him. And so again, the Americans had advance guards, skirmishers, in front of the Historical Society, okay, and then where they were going to build the target. Okay. All right, so the first skirmish took place at Union Street and West Main Road at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 29th. The American troops there were 300 of them against 1,800 Hessians. Not a very fair fight. And the Americans, although they slowed down the British, were forced to retreat back. And they retreated back down the valley, up the other side, to the vicinity of Lehigh Hill and Fort Butts. On the East Main Road at Union Street, again, the advancing British Army met an American picket line, and there was a surprise attack there, surprise on the British, that is. But those Americans also were forced to fall back along Middle Road, back to Quaker Hill, again, town hall. There was no town hall there then. Okay. And eventually those Americans fell back, more to the vicinity of the high school here, up on the hill. So this is what the battle lines looked like at that point. This is a map. And I don't know what I did with my pointer.
It's not this one.
No, it's not that. Let me focus that a little bit. Excuse me. Whoops. Okay. So what we have here is the British Army. Here's Turkey Hill, again above the compactor, and Quaker Hill, the town hall. And the British were along that line, along Headley Street and along Corey's Lane. Okay? And across the other side of the East Main Road as well. The Americans were in a position, primarily Fort Butts, which is right here, and down in front of Fort Butts on that hillside. Lehigh Hill is right here, on this wing of the American line. And Lehigh Hill came under attack by British ships as well as the troops. Okay. That's where the battle actually was fought. Okay. In that valley, again, right where Route 24 begins today. Okay. So the modern locations, the British and the Hessians were on the left. The Hessians were on the Abbey side. There's Almy's Hill, Anthony's Hill. I've seen about 6 different names for it, which is where the Abbey has a cross on that hill up above the school. The Hessians were on that wing, and then across Corey's Lane, Headley Street, Quaker Hill, Turkey Hill included. If you ever get a chance, go up Turkey Hill. Go up. You have to sort of plug your nose a little bit, but go up above the compactor station, and there's a park there called Heritage Park that had all kind of plans being made at the time of the 350th celebration that Portsmouth had 25 years ago. And it's kind of a mess, but some of it was planted. There were some stone walls put in and so on there. If you stand on top of that hill, you really can see the whole battle. You can see down the hill past the industrial park, up the other side to Fort Butts. You always see Fort Butts because it has a water tower in it. It's not hard to miss. And then you can see that whole thing. And then you can look to the left to see Corey's Lane and Anthony Hill, Almy's Hill out there. And you really can see the whole thing there. And it's a public park. I'm on the tree commission, and we're looking into fixing it up, getting rid of some of the bad stuff that's grown up in there. So anyway, we're working on that a little bit. But that's a really neat place to stand, walk around, don't go over the edge, but and see really how the whole battle was laid out from there. The Americans were in Fort Butts, itself, and down in front of it from Lehigh Hill all the way across the other side to the East Main Road. Lehigh's Hill then, I'm not sure where Lehigh came from, by the way, but it was also known as Durfee's Hill. It was also known as Burrington's Hill. I don't know that particular Durfee either, but Burrington, there was a Burrington Anthony who had a farm down where the Kaiser Tower is. So maybe that's where that came from. A lot of Anthonys over on that side of the island. Okay, so they looked at each other right across the valley there. The British attacked the American right wing. They came down off the hill by the Abbey and crossed Barker's Brook, as it was called then, crossed the brook, and it was pretty swampy, some of it down there, still is, and attacked up the other side, up Lehigh Hill. Okay. They tried 2 attempts to do that, to turn the American right wing. Had they turned the American right wing, the Americans would have been in really bad shape, because turning the American right wing would have almost cut off Howland's Ferry from the American troops. They could have almost been surrounded that way. So they tried twice and did not succeed. There were 2 attempts made at that point, and then, again, with support of the British warships offshore, the Bristol Ferry guns, the American guns at Bristol Ferry, also denied the British in their effort to come that way, to cut off the Americans' escape route. Finally, the Hessians tried a 3rd charge. And this one became pretty much of a bayonet charge, a hand-to-hand combat battle. And it too ultimately failed. By the way, all this is going on the same day, one day, from the skirmishes at East and West Main Roads and Union Street through the battle. Okay, they tried a 3rd charge then, and they were forced back. They were forced back from a redoubt that was on Lehigh Hill, and the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, along with the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, helped hold that right wing. And of course, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment included a group of former slaves who were fighting quite valiantly there under the command of Colonel Christopher Green and Major Samuel Ward. Okay, and that's why we have the Black Regiment Monument, which isn't exactly on the spot, but it's not far from it. Again, you have to go up the hill a little bit from there to get where they were. Meanwhile, there's also military action on the East Main Road down Quaker Hill toward Fort Butts, but that was slowed, and that kind of faded in late afternoon. That night, there was some cannonading across that valley, but essentially the battle itself was over. Sullivan and Piggott then had to decide what to do next. Piggott was waiting for reinforcements to come from New York, and hoping to evacuate, and Sullivan was hoping to evacuate his army from the island without further losses. Who won? Good question. Nobody decisively won the Battle of Rhode Island. That's one of the reasons it probably doesn't make it into the history books. You can read all kinds of accounts of Yorktown and Saratoga and a whole bunch of other battles, but we don't hear much about Rhode Island. It almost never gets into the history books, by the way. The casualties, again, these are official reports, and in studying this battle for the last 25 years, I've seen at least 30 different accounts of casualties, but these are the ones from the official reports anyway. 260 total on the British side and 211 on the American side. Okay. And the armies were fairly even, in the 4,000 or 5,000 range on both sides at the time of the actual battle. The troops recovered in place the next day and buried the dead. There are stories that they buried 50 Hessians in one place in the field behind off the old West Main Road. That's never been, it's been marked. It was marked in 1936 when Rhode Island was celebrating its tricentennial. Never been found to my knowledge, and I know a lot of people have been out there with metal detectors trying to find it. It was somewhere behind Thurston's Christmas Tree Farm, or where Thurston's Christmas Tree Farm used to be. Okay. All right. Now, Sullivan also got word that the D'Estaing's forces were not going to be available anytime soon, and so he also got a letter from Washington about Howe's reinforcements. and that they were probably on their way to Rhode Island. So he decided after a council war that he would evacuate his troops off the island, back to Tiverton. So the Americans reinforced their positions. They kept their tents up and things like that to make it look like they were still there, but they did begin to evacuate, and they were off by midnight on the 30th. Lafayette, out of breath I'm sure, was back in time to sort of supervise the last withdrawal across the Sakonnet River. And the next day, September 1st, well 2 days later, September 1st, Clinton and 4,300 reinforcements arrived in Newport. So the Americans got out just in time. Okay. Although they probably think that they would have done just as well. Anyway, the British reoccupied their former positions like Fort Butts and Bristol Ferry and elsewhere. And the Americans did not really seriously threaten to come back again after that. The reaction to the battle, there was a lot of frustration on the American side, especially Washington was very upset about the fact that the alliance with the French didn't work very well here. Obviously, it later would work very well, especially at Yorktown. But when Rochambeau came, and Rochambeau and Washington worked together on various campaigns, they had much more success. There's a lot of blame to be brought on both the French and the American side as to who was, who called who what first. And back and forth. Sullivan was no fan, and his final reports say that essentially that the French didn't cooperate. And the Stang said the Americans did their own thing. And so it's really difficult to assess any kind of responsibility for the lack of the freeing up of Newport. Sullivan got some condemnations and commendations, as you can see. In both cases, the French-American relations improved later and were especially critical at Yorktown, where Cornwallis looked out at sea and said, oh, there's the British fleet out there, thank God. But it was the French fleet instead. So he was forced to surrender at Yorktown. And that really is the last major action of the war. So this was the first attempt at joint operations with the French. It was an effort to drive the British out of Newport. The Americans, many without any experience, fought quite valiantly in this battle. Lafayette made a comment. Lafayette came back to the United States in 1824 and 25 after surviving the French Revolution, which was no easy thing for Lafayette. He was one side and the other, back and forth, as head of the National Guard. But he came and made the comment that he had enjoyed his time in Rhode Island and that the battle he felt was the best fought action of the war. But most significantly, and I think this is really critical, it was fought right here. And a lot of people don't know anything about it. And at least after this week and next week, well, about 120 people who will know. There were reenactments of the Battle of Rhode Island. And someone came up to me the other day and said, somebody said there were reenactments in 1978. Yeah, there was. 1978, the 200th, and 2003, the 225th. I did a lot of writing in 1978 for Sakonnet Times and things like that. And we had really good coverage. The press coverage was really excellent. And in 2003, I was the historian and the photographer for that. So I was involved in both of those. 1978, and this is just a couple pictures to show you a little bit about it. In 1978, fought at Lehigh Hill, fought at that same hill, right off the scenic overlook, down toward what was then the Kaiser Building, okay, which is a really important part of where the battle was fought. There were probably approximately 2,200 participants in that, several thousand spectators up the top of the hill. I was down in the high grass down to the bottom of the hill, getting close-ups. These are some of the scenes from that. The British gathering it at the Abbey, that's where they were. And then this, you can see on the bottom, the black and white picture, how the armies lined up. The British were up the hill, the Americans, no, is that right? No, the Americans were up the hill. Yeah, and the British came out of the woods and across in front of Kaiser. I tried very hard to keep Kaiser building out of my pictures. And again, they just stood there and blasted the hell out of one another. There's the Kaiser building, you can see it. And then they retreated by boat across Howland's Ferry. Okay. They restaged all of that. It was really a lot of fun. And then in 2003, the reenactment, because now the Carnegie Abbey had taken over the battlefield, or part of it. The reenactment was held at the Glen, where there was some fighting during the battle. And this was an amazing, I was on the committee of this for about a year and a half, and it was just amazing all the planning that went into this. But the picture on the right, you can see it, it's really cool because we were standing along the road in the Glen, okay, Linden Lane, and then looking out across the fields toward the nursery property further out, and here comes the British line across. It was really cool. And there they are. It was fun. We had about an equal number of British and American reenactors. And then, unfortunately, we had the battle. A couple different battles, actually. This was fought over a whole weekend. This is in the field down below the tractor pool, okay, in the Glen where they have the tractor pool. And that's it.
Did you ever hear about Brownell Hill? I read.
Yeah, the Brownell Hill goes up to the senior center, from the coal mine area up the hill to the senior center, from Kaiser up to the senior, Carnegie Abbey up to the senior center.
It's not written on any map. I could never.
No, there's a Brownell family farmhouse on that though, about halfway up on the left as you're going up the hill. Yeah.
You know where that is?
No, I have pictures of it. In fact, I have an old picture, 100-year-old picture of it. Yeah, that was another hill in that same area, though. I'm sure there was some fighting going on right there too. Other questions? Yes, Mike.
In your opinion, who do you think won the battle of Rhode Island, like from a military standpoint?
Well, it's frustrating because we didn't push the British off the island. But the thing was that the British realized the strategic significance of this, and therefore they poured all these extra troops into it. So, you know, it wasn't exactly a fair fight, because Sullivan's army went from 10,000 to about 4,500 over the month of August. Their 20 days were up. You hired me on the 1st. You said I had to put down my plow and pick up my rifle and come for 20 days. All right, it's the 20th. I haven't done anything yet. And so they went home. Harvest time. I mean, they're farmers, a lot of them. Yeah, and you know, they were just lucky the battle wasn't fought through their cornfields. But I think that I think you have to say a draw pretty much, that neither side was victorious. The British still stayed for another year. They held on to Newport, and Newport was absolutely devastated by the British occupation. And Newport began to come back. I mean, they burned wharves and everything else. But Newport came back somewhat in the 1790s. And then with the Embargo Act and things like that in the early 1800s, Newport collapsed and never recovered. And all of a sudden somebody from South Carolina said, oh, it's a good place to go in the summer, you know, in 1840s. And that's when the resort aspect started. But it was a big commercial port. It's hard for us to appreciate how important Newport was in 1760, 1770. Really important.